Matthew, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure, Tom. Thanks for having me with you today. My name is Matthew Ho. I'm running as a Green Party candidate for the U.S. Senate in North Carolina. I'm a former Marine, disabled combat veteran. Have worked on issues of foreign policy and human rights, primarily anti-war work, as well as local issues here at home for the last 12 years or so. And I am a first-time political candidate.
Awesome. Could you tell me more about your policies and what you hope to accomplish if you get elected into Senate?
Right. Yeah. So the Green Party is a eco-socialist party, as we describe ourselves. We are, simply put, a pro-worker, pro-peace, pro-planet party. You know, another tagline we can use is people, planet, and peace over profit. So kind of give you a basis of where our philosophy is. We are for greater direct democracy, expanding, making our democracy more inclusive, strengthening our democracy through things like ranked choice voting, proportional representation, getting money out of politics, abolishing the electoral college, et cetera. We are, of course, very concerned about climate. The Green Party introduced the Green New Deal in about 2006. And the Green New Deal is of course, a massive national effort to not just rebuild the energy network, but to reimagine and reconstruct our entire economy. And that ties that into our belief that human rights, housing, healthcare, education, jobs are human rights. And so we have an economic bill of rights that's included with the Green New Deal. Briefly, that would include things like single payer healthcare. That would include an annualized living wage tied to, in my opinion, tied to local housing costs that then serve as a form of rent control. We are dedicated to ending the wars, not just the wars overseas, but the wars here at home. So ending the war on drugs, ending the crime against humanity that is occurring at our border. I think if that was occurring anywhere else in the world, that's how we would describe that. And then there's a host of other issues. I could be here kind of all day, and certainly we are very, very concerned over civil liberties, very concerned for LGBTQIA rights, of course, trans rights as a part of that, pro-choice, right? So a host of civil liberty issues that are paramount to us, as well as ones that fall under other categories as well, such as saying ending the surveillance state, ending the illegal spying by our government that's been going on for the better part of 2 decades now. So if people want to learn more about my platform, they can go to my website. It's MatthewHoforsenate.org, and we have a whole issues page there. You can read more about specifically certain issues.
A lot of it very similar to the Democratic Party. Why are you for the Green Party as opposed to a Democrat?
Well, I would argue against that, Tom. I think the amount of overlap between my policies and what the Democratic Party represents, who they represent, and what they have done is quite drastic. In North Carolina, there are 15 Democrats running for federal office, 1 for the U.S. Senate, 14 for the House seats. Only one of those Democrats supports single-payer health care, Medicare for all. Only one. There's a Democrat who's running for the House who votes against Planned Parenthood in the state Senate. There's a Democrat running for the House who just voted for the Don't Say Gay bill in the North Carolina state Senate. So we have, onesies and twosies within the Democratic Party who do overlap with us. But if you look, compare my platform versus the platform of Sherry Beasley, who is a Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate in North Carolina, you'll see that our overlap is not very great. And where we differ are on things that are life and death, things that are very, that are causing tens of millions of Americans to suffer, whether that be healthcare, wages, housing, the war on drugs. Certainly, if you look at Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd, who is the Republican nominee, you can say that there's a lot more overlap with those two than there is with me and the Democrat. And I would say that's issues of war, both overseas, the war on drugs, border policy, issues of support for corporations and the banks. Certainly, if you look at Beasley's attitude and relationship towards big agriculture, towards the pharma, towards Wall Street, you're not going to see much difference between her and her Republican opponent on those things. So it pushed back very, very heavily on that idea that somehow we are similar when there is a great difference between us on issues that directly impact tens of millions of families. And I mean, I also too, look, we're a socialist party. I'm not sure why we're supposed to be in a Democratic Party that routinely defines itself as capitalist.
Yeah, because that's typically, as Americans, we think of the Democratic Party as supporting a lot of the things that you advocate for. But when you dig down into it, the Democratic Party does seem to have a lot more similarities with the Republican Party in the way that it operates. And even though many very big political speakers like Bernie Sanders or something in the Democratic Party advocate for a lot more social programs, the vast majority of the Democratic Party seem to be more in line with the Republicans on a lot of things, and there's not a lot of change going on. Why do you think that is?
I think it basically comes down to the two-party system as we know it is captured by money, and that both parties are beholden to their big money donors. And I know that's trite to say, and I know, but I mean, we've had studies for decades now, and more recently, the famous 2014 study from Princeton that says the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. And I think you look at this and you see how people are living. Look, the best example I can give you in terms of how it affects people in my neighborhood, on my block, the folks who used to live across the street from me, is that in 2009, 2010, 2011, 12 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. The Obama administration bailed out the banks and provided no relief for those homeowners. The banks then took that money and started buying up those foreclosed homes, turning it into a new form of investment for them. They created entire corporations to do this. And we are now here in North Carolina seeing where, depending on where you live, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 homes are being purchased by corporations whose genesis was exactly in that denial of assistance for homeowners and the bailing out of banks. So, I mean, that's a Democratic policy, and that has a direct effect on our people. Again, across the street, corporation came in, bought their home, rent went up by 50%, her and her kids had to move. And that's a story we hear over and over again. And that's a deliberate result of government policy that is a bipartisan policy. We've had these policies of, particularly for me, this comes back to the financialization policies we've had for decades now that have chosen to make sure the corporations and the banks, and by extension, the wealthy, prosper at the expense of working people. And now we used to have this divide in this country, right, of who working class are, who's middle class, who's white collar, who's blue collar. But the way the economics are shaking out, the fact that one survey a few weeks ago identified almost 66% of Americans as living paycheck to paycheck, those distinctions really don't matter anymore. I mean, everybody is getting squeezed because for 50 years or so, the policies of our government have been to make sure all the money is squeezed to the top. And we see that, through tax codes, regulations. And so what we say is, well, who's standing up for those who are being squeezed out? And that's who we are trying to represent on the ballot in November.
So what would you say about the argument that giving money to the rich doesn't really seem to hurt inflation much, whereas if we give money to the poor, that seems to cause a significant amount of inflation? It seems like the reason that the Democrats, Republicans give money to the rich and try to pay off the banks instead of giving it to the people is because if you give it to the people, it causes inflation, kind of like what we're seeing today, which can cause equally or greater problems down the road.
I think the level of government spending, where money has been put, trillions of dollars into capital intensive programs like the defense industry, the trillions of dollars that the Fed has put into the asset markets, which has led to the wealth increase that we've seen by the Musks, Zuckerbergs, right, the Gateses. I mean, that's tied directly to the fact that the Fed for the last 2 years has been putting anywhere from $80 to $120 billion into the markets every month, right? And the idea that inflation is somehow tied to a $1,200 check that we received 18 months ago, right? I mean, it's just preposterous. It just doesn't make sense. Along with the fact that there are a lot of other things occurring in our economy, whether it's the pandemic, the supply chain breakdown, and simply the decision by corporations to raise prices. I think this idea that we have 40-year record high inflation that is really hurting people. At the same time, though, corporations are making record profits like that. The math just doesn't add up. And we've seen studies from organizations like the Economic Policy Institute that have pointed out that, look, when you factor in the wage increases that workers have received over the last 2 years, which amount to like 3 or 4%, but which are astronomical because workers hadn't received wage increases for 40 years, when you factor that in, though, that only accounts for less than 10% of inflationary pressure. And so, yeah, of course, there's energy issues, there's issues with the war in Ukraine. Climate change has had a huge impact on our food prices. This was reported a little bit last year, but not as much as it should have been. I think Bloomberg talked about this. But, all these wildfires, these droughts, these floods that are particularly wrecking the agriculture in the west of our country have caused our food prices to go up. And when you combine it with everything else, you start to see, but as well, we also know that there's been deliberate price fixing by corporations. I mean, I think one of the things that came out last month was the revealing that Tyson Foods was directly involved with the Trump administration to keep their meatpacking facilities open during the pandemic. That Tyson wrote the executive order that Trump issued that that kept the meatpacking plants, the slaughterhouses, open. And in that, you can see how Tyson business was good. And Tyson decided that business would still remain good if they jacked prices up. And they are able to do that, and they get away with it. And of course, American families, working families, middle-class families are the ones who are paying for it now. And certainly we see inflation all over the place, right? I mean, look at gas prices. If you work 15, close to even $20 an hour, depending on where you live in the country, it can cost you 2/3 of a day's pay, maybe even closer to a day's pay to fill up your car, right? So commuting back and forth to work, taking your kids to soccer and, wherever else you're going, and you're putting gas in your car once a week, you could be paying, half to a day's pay just to fill your car up. So the consequences really are bearing down on people. And, this doesn't even get into aspects of healthcare, the opioid overdose epidemic, the continuing pandemic, et cetera, et cetera.
So you mentioned that one of the big causes of this is money in politics. How would you try to get money out of politics? That seems like the current politicians have a vested interest to not allow you to do that. It seems like quite a big challenge. What would be your plans in order to try to accomplish that enormous feat?
Yeah, it is. It's an enormous challenge, particularly with Citizens United. Does it have to go to the point of a constitutional amendment? And I think many people are coming back to that and seeing a host of other issues that say, do we have to approach this in the sense that we have to do massive change? And I think many Americans are agreeable with that, seeing what has occurred, particularly say the last couple of weeks from the Supreme Court, that this system we have, this goes back, 250 some odd years, in that, it's just, Thomas Paine said this, and it really influenced Thomas Jefferson. This idea that the government is for the living, not for the dead. To be governed by the decisions of those from a couple hundred years ago is just, in my opinion, insane. And Jefferson took that and ran with it. And he had this idea, right, that every 19 years, we're going to rewrite the Constitution, right? I mean, so I think Jefferson probably took that a little farther than he should. But Paine's argument was that, look, this is why we are governed by the living, not by the dead. And that's what we're dealing with here. And so I think the idea of pursuing constitutional amendments is something that we can't just dismiss because it's too hard. Getting money out of politics also involves more direct democracy. So this is why we go back to ranked choice voting and then to the idea eventually of proportional representation. Another idea that people dismiss as too hard, but then you say, what are we doing? There's only like 2 other democracies, maybe 3 in the country that have our version of Congress, right? That have a 2-party system or a first past the post system. Almost everybody else has a parliamentary system, a proportional representation system, whatever you want to call it. You don't have to call it parliament if you don't like that. We can call it something else. But the idea is that what we have allowed to continue is hurting us. And I think everyone's in agreement that the money that's in politics is defining what our government does. It defines our policies. It defines our choices. It defines what we are allowed. It picks the winners and losers, right? I mean, so yeah, what we're talking about, certainly, Tom, is not easy answers, but the suffering and the catastrophe that's occurring, and just as importantly, the climate collapse that is occurring and that is coming, if we don't prepare ourselves for that, we will have that existential crisis that people are warning us of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I definitely think that there are major consequences to not solving these problems, but I think the biggest issue is understanding how we can solve the problems. You mentioned like a constitutional reform. I don't. That would take Congress to actually make it so that
Right.
Congress couldn't make money. That's going to be a tough sell.
Yeah.
So, what strategies do you have planned to try to move this policy forward, to try to gain support for this policy in a way that can influence Congress and the House or the executive branch to actually do something about it?
Right. I think it's threefold, what we're looking at. One is to build a party, and a party has to be bigger than the party. A party can't exist just for the sake of the party. A party has to be part of a larger movement, and this would be, of course, a movement that represents. I hate the term left right. I use it all the time because it's easy. It's part of our grammar, right? It's how we talk about this, but it's not very helpful to understand the complexity and nuance and scale of our politics. But just to, I guess, use it, the party of the left, but more importantly, a pro-worker party, a party of the worsening middle class, right? A party that understands the reality of climate, and a party that's not dedicated to the big money donors. And so if you have that type of movement, the party is just one arm of that movement. And you have to, of course, have other aspects of it: labor organizing, education, direct action, and community action, all other parts of the body. But the political party is just one. But we build that political party. The second aspect, because there's space for it. And I think we see there's space for it. I think people who are concerned about these things see the fact that, the Democrats say that, well, Joe Manchin is the reason why none of this is getting done, why we don't have an increase in the minimum wage, why Build Back Better didn't occur, all these various, why the Voting Rights Act didn't, happen, and now why we're not going to codify abortion rights in the Senate is because of Joe Manchin, Joe Manchin, Joe Manchin. And then you look and you see Joe Manchin is still the chair of the Senate Energy Committee. I mean, how is this possible? If this guy is completely destroying everything the Democrats supposedly stand for, why is this guy even in the party, let alone the chair of that Energy Committee, right? I mean, so you see people see that, they're fed up with that. And I think there's availability, there's space for a party that represents those people. I'll say then the second aspect of this is to put such pressure on the Democratic Party, and to a degree the Republican Party, and the libertarians do this from the right, that they do adopt some of our policies. And we've seen this in American history. You've seen this, say, with labor reforms that occurred at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. That came about because of the pressure that parties like the People's Party or the Populist Party, the Socialist Party, the Progressive parties were putting on the Democrats and Republicans in the 1880s, roughly through the 1920s. So they were forced to take on some of these issues in order to fend off this third party challenge. And look, as long as our people get health care, as long as we convert to a single payer system where people are not dying because they can't afford to go to the doctor, then I'm okay with whoever delivers that. And then the third aspect is to put such pressure on the system. And again, the libertarians and independents can be a part of this as well, where you are, again, putting this pressure on the system that the system has to change. That the Democrats and Republicans, and I disagree with this. I disagree with the notion of being a spoiler. I do identify with being a disruptor, though. If our elections, can you still hear me, Tom? Because I can see I froze up. Okay. Or I froze up on my end, at least.
Yeah, you're still going good on my end. I can still see you and hear you clearly.
Okay. All right. Great. I won't put my finger anywhere on camera where it shouldn't be. But this idea that if we disrupt the system, if we cause the two-party system not to work, the first past the post, 50+1 not to work because there's multiple parties in it, and the Republicans, Democrats feel that they are losing because of that, then they will start to amend the system. Then they will start to take on ranked choice voting. They will start to take on the idea of maybe a proportional representation, answering some of the other ideas for direct democracy. The money aspect, getting back to that question, is a very troubling one. And that's what we see fuels the parties. That's where their interests align. That's who they belong to. And that explains why Joe Manchin is still the chair of the Senate Energy Committee. I mean, you can have all the arguments you want, all the platforms coming out of the Democratic Party about how they understand the reality of climate, but then they do these things, as well as to say, just like what happened last week, where Joe Biden is again expanding offshore drilling. So that's the three-prong approach I see as to how we achieve our goals: build the party, force the two main party to take on issues that we represent because of the popularity of those issues, and then the third one is to create such disruption that the system has to change to accommodate us.
Yeah, you mentioned putting pressure on the parties and the disruption. How exactly do you put pressure on these titan parties to actually get them to change?
Yeah, I think it's you cause them loss. You cause them loss. Look, we're up against a Goliath here. We're up against the Leviathan. In 2020, the U.S. Senate race in North Carolina was $300 million. I mean, that's what the Democrats, Republicans, and outside groups spent on the Senate race in North Carolina in 2020. This year, it'll be 325, 350, maybe 400. In some place they'll have a $500 million Senate race, and we know that the presidential elections certainly are billions of dollars. So, and even at the local level, we see the money being corruptive, right? I mean, like if you look here in North Carolina at the Raleigh City Council, I don't think there's anyone on that city council who does not receive money from real estate developers, including real estate developers out of state. The mayor of Raleigh, which is this is a whole other thing that's crazy. The mayor of Raleigh has a $1 billion budget every year, city of 600,000 or something like that. The mayor is part-time. What's the mayor's full-time job? She works for a construction and development firm. I mean, so you have not just the money, but you have blatant conflicts of interest that are allowed. And the idea is to represent those who are furious at that. And so even in a system where, we're up against $300 million, how do we even get ourselves recognized or noticed when we are faced with that type of edifice? It's very difficult. But the idea is that if we can do 5 to 10% this year, that causes a big disruption in the elections because it pulls from both parties. It causes people to be involved in the process who wouldn't have been involved before, which is actually the main thing. Third parties bring in people to vote way more than they do by pulling people away from how they were going to cast their votes. It helps expand democracy by having more parties. But this idea, though, of being that constant presence. And so the fact that the parties, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, feel that we have to acknowledge this. We just can't ignore them. We just can't continue to suppress them, do our dirty tricks and everything else to keep them off the ballot. We have to face this. And with that as well comes the media attention. So the idea that you are getting more notice, more attention, that you're speaking to this, bringing more people to your movement so that the parties, the two major parties, feel like if we do not respond, we will lose voters. And we've seen that. Look, in North Carolina, 20 years ago, the Democrats made up about 48 or 49% of voter registration, of voter affiliation. Republicans were about 33%, and unaffiliated was 17%. Just this year, unaffiliated became the biggest block of registered voters in North Carolina. When the Democrats went from 48 to 49% down to about 33%, the Republicans stayed at 33%. And where did all those voters go? They went to unaffiliated. Now 34, 35% of voters in North Carolina are unaffiliated. AP just had a story last week that 1 million people have switched registration across the country from Democrat to Republican. That, of course, is something I don't like it. That's awful to me. But you can see the fact that the Democratic Party has to make the decision. Is it going to answer the clear exit of its people, particularly younger people, or is it going to continue to align itself with its corporate interests? I think the biggest mistake the Democrats have made, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I'm running, is in you look at the number of voters, the 12.5 million Obama 2012 voters who either voted for Donald Trump in 2016 or sat out the election. 12.5 million. I think the Democrats not looking at that. And that 12.5 million also roughly corresponds with the number of people who lost their homes during the Obama administration. Not saying it's a one-for-one thing, but it's interesting that you have those numbers match up, right? So yeah, no, I think that's the type of pressure we're talking about is causing people to support something, giving people an opportunity to support something that they don't have now, puts that pressure on the Democrats and the Republicans to answer what those voters are saying.
I have a follow-up question to that, but also have a quick question from the audience. Super Squid Hunk asks, how does he feel about term limits?
I am very supportive of term limits. And I think, as many people are saying now too, that includes the judiciary. I think many people are saying, how is it possible we can have someone on the Supreme Court for life? And it's the way it's been. Just because it's the way it's been doesn't mean it's the way it should continue. But no, I am supportive of term limits in Congress. I'm supportive of term limits in general. If it was up to me, I would, my belief is that we should increase the limits in the House from 2 years to 3 years, just so people in the House aren't constantly campaigning. They get at least a year not to have to campaign, but then give them two years or 2 terms. And, the same in the Senate, let them have 1 6-year term, and I would do the same with, maybe if you want to have the Senate be 2 terms, that's fine. But with the president as well, I would limit the president's term to 1 6-year term. If someone goes in the White House and they can't get something done in 6 years, why do we expect them to get something done in those other 2? And if you take away the need to campaign, the need to curry favor from donors, the need to raise money, that the president has to do, or any politician has to do, I think that frees you up from the type of politics we see, which are so devoted to money. So in a way, that becomes a way of getting money out of politics, right? The idea that if the president only can run once, that if a senator can only run once or twice, the same with a member of the House, that somehow precludes their interest in, having a long-term relationship with the big donors.
Absolutely. So to go back to making an impact and influencing the parties, you mentioned ranked choice voting, because it seems like the first past the post system we have kind of makes it hard to, even if you get people who support your position, for them to actually vote for you, because if they go to the poll and they see Green Party as opposed to Republican or Democrat, it seems they're more likely to vote against the person they hate rather
Right.
than the person they advocate for, simply because if you vote for a third party and it's essentially not even close to the top 2, then your votes don't even get counted. It's just like they're not even there. So how exactly would you manage to change the voting system to a ranked choice voting system so that people who do support you can actually represent that in the polls?
Yeah, one of the things other people talk about this as well is the idea that we shouldn't have party affiliation on the ballot sheets. That people identify who they're voting for based on a name and not by party. And as you said, Tom, this idea that people vote against, and we see that, and this is one of the issues of the 2-party system, right? The identity politics, the red versus blue. Something like 40 to 50% of Republicans describe Democrats as evil, and a similar number of Democrats describe Republicans that same way. So this is a case of using the proverbial other, to demonize and terrorize your base into voting for you because they are scared or horrified or just angered at the other side. The idea with ranked choice voting is that it takes away this notion that if I don't vote for the lesser of 2 evils, the more evil is going to win. Right. So that if I vote for the Green Party candidate or Libertarian candidate or this independent candidate, well, that's one less vote that can go to the lesser evil. I don't like Hillary Clinton, but I don't want Donald Trump in there. I don't like Joe Biden. I mean, I don't like Donald Trump, but I don't want Joe Biden in there. So I'm going to vote for Trump because I hate Biden more. Or I'm going to vote for Clinton because I fear Trump more, or whatever. With ranked choice voting, the way that works is that you vote for a candidate, and then you are able to give second, third, fourth level votes, or no more votes. You don't have to cast any more than you want to. You can just vote for one person. But it as it says, ranks your choice. And then if nobody achieves that 50% threshold, then you start going into the counting process of, okay, how many people got second choice votes, right? And that adds up. And that's how you get to a winner in a ranked choice vote. And that idea is that you're now allowing people to vote on their conscience. You're allowing people to vote on their beliefs, allowing people to vote on their political and economic philosophies. They're not voting on identity. They're not voting against, but it provides the opportunity to vote for. And whether it is a candidate or party that you like, or it's because the issues that are being ran on are issues that will actually affect you, your family, your community, it does allow for that. And it in my opinion, really undoes what we're dealing with here right now with, this identity-based politics, red versus blue, team style attitude. People go into the ballot box now, Tom, and they're compromising their vote even before they cast their vote. They're approaching the ballot like there's some type of Fox News or MSNBC pundit, and doing this like electoral jujitsu of like, which is the least bad choice for me, and trying to strategize. If I vote for this person, that will not mean a vote for that person, et cetera, et cetera. And, when you go into the ballot, you go into the voting booth, and you've already compromised your vote for a candidate that you feel is compromised. Why do you think you're going to get any result out of our political process other than something that's going to be against you? I mean, that's just the nature of it. So it allows that opportunity for people, again, to vote on issues, people to vote their beliefs, their conscience, what they really want, as opposed to taking part in, it's best summarized as the lesser of two evil system.
What would be the process to actually get ranked choice, for example, passed as a nationwide policy? What would it take to do that?
There actually have been moves in Congress. I think Jim McGovern and in the House, and I want to say Ed Markey in the Senate have both put forward the Fair Ballot Act, which encourages ranked choice voting. I mean, we're seeing ranked choice voting more and more around the country. We have it in Maine. They have it in Alaska. Cities in Los Angeles. I'm sorry, cities in California have it. It's being adopted more and more at the local level. I think the process to get it adopted at the state level and eventually the national level is to put that kind of pressure. One is to show that it works. Right. So you have these cases where, look, it worked. The second is to, again, put that pressure where we are continuing to run third parties and independents in a system that is only designed to handle two parties, and that the disruption to that causes such catastrophe for the existing major parties, for the corporate parties, that they have to say, OK, we're going to go to this because this will stop the bleeding. This will make sure we don't lose because there were a third party and an independent in the race that were really great candidates. People voted for them rather than our candidate, and that's why we lost. But if there's a system where, okay, we would have gotten the second and third votes, then we would have won. If we show that that's how it works, and if we put that pressure on the two parties, cause them pain, right, then they will be forced to do something. I mean, eventually that has to occur, because what they're doing now is just continuing to devolve. And, and another reason why we have to fight for this and work for this, because if they do continue to choose just to devolve, just to ignore it, just to try and get to the point where they're excluding everybody from the political process who doesn't watch Fox News or MSNBC, then the issues, the pain, the suffering, the deterioration of the American economy, the American society that we're witnessing now will only continue to worsen.
Yeah, you mentioned, you sent me an article your team did about how the Democrats are like trying to use some kind of nefarious means to exclude you from the ballot or something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get on the ballot, we had to collect 15,000. I'm sorry, we had to collect 13,865 signatures. We collected 22,500 signatures. Of those 22,500 signatures, 15,953 were verified by the county boards of elections. We met all our deadlines. Did everything procedurally correct. The state board of elections, which is a partisan organization. Three Democrats, two Republicans are the board of the state board of elections. Last Thursday, after having our petitions for 30 days, again, after the county board of elections certified our results, decided that they needed more time to investigate and to look at our petitions, even though they had provided no evidence to us of anything that should mean that we should not be certified. Their argument ran that since there's a July 1st deadline for us to be certified by the state, that the state board of elections, because they said we need more time to investigate because there could be issues. We can't tell you what the issues are. We can't show you, but there could be issues. We need more time to investigate. But because tomorrow's a deadline, there's not enough time. We can't certify because there could be issues. I mean, that was the reasoning put forward by denying us certification. So we are, of course, going to challenge that and fight that because we feel, a number of our rights were violating, including due process. And there are other aspects of this as well, too. There, the State Board of Elections falsely asserted that we were under criminal investigation to the media when we're not under criminal investigation. And then parallel to all that, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the DSCC, has been down here for a couple of weeks now with the Elias law firm, which is Mark Elias's law firm. Mark Elias being the general counsel for John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, arguably the most prominent Democratic attorney in the country. His law firm is down here, and for the last couple of weeks, they have been calling people who signed our petitions, texting them, showing up at their doors in an effort to get them to remove their names from the petitions. This includes, and we have audio recordings of all this, people calling on behalf of the DSCC by identifying themselves as being with the Green Party, asking people to remove their names from our petitions. So there's a deliberate misleading fraud, if you will, by the DSCC and the Elias law firm to get people to remove their names in a very calculated manner, and so that runs parallel to the efforts, to the issues we've had with the State Board of Elections not certifying us in a brazenly partisan decision.
What do you think you could do to better accommodate for that in the future? What could an aspiring Green Party candidate do if they also wanted to try to run and avoid those kinds of issues? Would simply like sitting way earlier or something be a way to try to avoid that?
No, I mean, I don't know what could have been done differently. Like I've said, we could have gone in there with Moses as our attorney and had 200,000 signatures and it wouldn't have mattered. The argument against us was simply that because there could be more, we have to investigate further, but we don't have time to do that. So we're not going to certify you. And this is after them taking the full 30 days to look at our petitions and finding minor issues. I mean, the things that we know about are clear, don't amount to any type of organized fraud or any way we were trying to rig the process, and nothing that they found actually was ever verified. So it never counted towards our, goal. We surpassed the threshold by more than 2,000. Like I said, we turned in 22,500, which is, if I did my math right, about 160% more than we needed to turn in. And so, yeah, the problem is the partisan nature of it, the way that the two-party system, this comes back to what we're talking about. The two-party system is exclusive, it's corrupt, and it's undemocratic, and it's harmful. And, the thing that's troubling about it, Tom, is that in that hearing, and we were allowed very little involvement in hearing, and actually, and people can go online and look at this, when our attorney tried to ask a question, when he asked, does any of what you're talking about, this could be more issues that you have to look at, does any of that touch the 15,953 signatures that have been verified by the county? The chair of the State Board of Elections refused to answer. He said there was a criminal investigation, so he couldn't answer. Again, there is no criminal investigation. He was either mistaken or lying about that. And then when our attorney tried to follow up, he shut down our attorney. He yelled over him and ordered that our attorney's microphone be muted. I mean, so it was very brazen. But through this, you had the two Republicans on the board arguing for us. So that's why I say it was so overtly partisan, because nobody was taking an approach to this that came from a level of like, here are the facts. This is what occurred. This is the actual issue at hand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, it was just straight partisan. And I know that if we were the libertarians in there trying to get on the ballot, or an independent who was conservative trying to get on the ballot, it would have been the opposite. The Republicans would have been making the arguments the Democrats did, and the Democrats making the arguments that the Republicans did. So I say all this, don't think that I'm just bashing the Democrats for the sake of Democrat bashing. I'm bashing the entire system, the entire two-party structure, and the partisan makeup of it that dominates so much of our government institutions.
There seems to be a lot of policies that have a large amount of approval by the American people, 70, 80% on like legalization of marijuana, abortion rights, healthcare reform, but they don't seem to ever get passed in the House or the Senate. There doesn't seem to be any action taken on them, or very little. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there are these things that have so much support by the American people, but they never seem to get done in politics?
Yeah, a lot of it comes back to the money. Who benefits? Certainly with the healthcare, the status quo of healthcare is that, we have, what was the study that came out from National Academy of Sciences a few weeks ago? 1 in 3 COVID deaths directly attributable to a lack of healthcare, a lack of health insurance. So 1 in 3 people of the million people who have died from COVID were killed by the for-profit healthcare industry. I mean, and we see the evidence of how it works in literally every other country that we can compare ourselves to. And it just comes back to the money. On other issues where there may not be the money, say like abortion, you have it's such a good wedge issue. It's one of the few issues that really differentiate the Republicans and the Democrats from one another. And so these social issues, which are important, of course, I'm not saying they're not important, but these are issues that allow the Democrats, Republicans really to go into that identity politics, right? Really get people to just identify with themselves as opposed to someone else, and feel threatened by that other. I mean, so I think it's those two things, Tom. It's the money that backs a lot of this. The idea that somehow the corporations, the banks who are supportive of both parties are going to be hurt by a decision that's not only popular but necessary, say like real action on the climate, or healthcare, or action that would help renters or entry-level homeowners, right? I mean, but the other aspect is that these are good. Some of it's just good wedge issues that both the Democrats and Republicans can campaign and fundraise on, and have been doing so for 50 years quite successfully. So for them, even though as more people fall away from the political system, even as things worsen for us, the two-party system continues to serve the two parties quite well.
What is your position on the abortion, the Roe v. Wade recent debacle?
Debacle is the right word, right, man? Look, you got to give the Republicans their due. I'm horrified of what happened, but you have to look at what the Republicans did for the last 50 years and how they arrived at this point. They're very strategic about it. I think after Roe, under Ford and Reagan, the idea was they're going to get a constitutional amendment and get rid of abortion that way. And then they adjusted and they say this is there's a better way to do this. And they went with a Federalist Society approach, where we're going to take over the courts. We're going to take over the state houses, and we're going to get the judges in power that we need. And then we're going to make sure that the cases come up that we need. We're either going to pass laws that prompt something like Dobbs, so that we will have a Supreme Court decision, or we are going to have cases that are allowed, where we can strike down laws that allow for freedom of choice. So it was strategically very well done by the Republicans. I mean, completely, I'm sickened by it, but you have to see that they had a strategy, they put it in place, they financed it, they built it, and after 50 years, it delivered. I mean, the idea that somehow our response should be to continue the same opposition to that strategy that we've seen in place for the last 50 years is idiotic. I mean, this idea that, oh, okay, this time we're going to do it better. That's, I mean, it's over. It's lost. We have to pick ourselves up and we have to do something different. We have to reimagine it. We have to reimagine our structures of government. We have to reimagine our constitution. We have to, and again, those are big, hard things. Same time too, though, look at what the Republicans did with something that probably a lot of people in the 70s and 80s said, it's too hard to do this. It's going to take too long, but they got it. I mean, so it's that's the response I have to it. Of course, I'm sickened by the whole idea of what's occurred. This thing that happened the other day in Ohio, where a 10-year-old girl had to go to Indiana to get an abortion because she had been raped. I mean, the whole idea of who are we as a society that this is what we do to our people, to our neighbors, to our brothers and sisters and their children. I mean, the lack of compassion in this country, and then of course it gets back to me for the abortion argument is the idea of bodily autonomy, right? And this idea that we are, we are responsible for ourselves in that manner. And so, yeah, it is. It's quite revolting. I think it's another blow against the Democratic Party. It shows why we need more parties. I think the Democratic Party is it's trite to say this, but they're happy to fundraise off of this. They raised $80 million in the last month. There's some great articles that Republicans were just, their jaws were dropping because they knew the Democrats knew this decision was coming for a month, and they did nothing. They literally did nothing but fundraise. And, you read these accounts from Republicans who said they were watching this, just amazed that the Democrats weren't doing anything, or at least attempting to do something in the month before the decision came out. So, it's frustrating. It's scary because of where that decision can go. I think we have to recognize that the Supreme Court needs to be overhauled. I mean, you see that hashtag abolish SCOTUS. And I think there's some veracity to that. Some this idea, again, it goes back to what we were talking before about, we're being governed by the dead, not by the living. This idea, according to the decision, that the only things that we can have are the things that existed in 1850 or 1793 is nuts. I mean, that's I can't even find the right words to describe that, but that's the system we're living under. As defined by the Roberts Alito court, these 6 religious nuts who want to control everything for everybody, and say, this is, you're talking like I was in Afghanistan. I've sat down with, I've met Taliban. This is what you're talking about, that level of thinking. Well, if it didn't exist when the prophet was around, we can't have it now. And that's more or less what Alito and others are saying. If it didn't exist when Washington and Jefferson and Franklin were knocking back beers together, then we can't have it. And that's just crazy. And the harm that's going to come is really is really going to be devastating.
Do you think there's a way to move forward and to appeal new cases instead of going for like a privacy issue, go for like a self-defense bodily autonomy issue? Because I agree, I think it's more of a bodily autonomy issue rather than a privacy issue. And it seems like pregnancy would qualify as all of the different justifications for the legal definition of great bodily harm, permanent and prolonged disfigurement, scarring, mental anguish, acute physical pain. It seems like all the different criterion that we use to establish it's justified to use lethal force seem to apply to pregnancy a lot more so than many of the other legal cases. Do you think that's a possible avenue to try to overcome the current ruling?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Tom. I agree. This idea that the state is going to dictate to a person whether they are pregnant or not is, you can extrapolate where that can go in terms of what else can the state dictate to. So I think that argument of personhood, bodily autonomy, again, right, we're stuck on Thomas Paine, but the rights of man, those types of things. I think that's the argument that I would choose to make. But I also think that we have to recognize that the Republicans won this, and to try and attack what they're doing throughout the South, say, in terms of at their state houses, with the same tactics and strategy that have been used for the last 30 years that were defeated by the Republicans, is only going to allow for more defeat. What I really get nervous about, Tom, is the idea that this decision is states-based, right? So the states have the right to decide this. I'm worried that people in California and New York, other places where you will not see these assaults on abortion rights or gay rights or a whole host of other things, will be comfortable in California and New York, and that they will just write off Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the southern states, because it's not going to happen in New York. It's not going to happen in Massachusetts. It's not going to happen in, wherever, whatever blue states. And that's what I really worry about, that we are sliding further into a divided country that judicially has allowed people in some states to have more rights than others, simply based upon the color on the map, if it's red or blue, and that rights are not extended to all people, but are based upon who composes your state legislature. And that's, and I live in a southern state in North Carolina, and we'll have a big election here in the fall. I don't see the Democrats doing anything to keep the Republicans from getting a supermajority, here in North Carolina, that would be able to override Governor Cooper's veto on this issue. The thing about it is why we have to bring more people in the political process, why we can't give up on the political process, why we can't continue to go with the failed political process that has brought us here, but we have to redo it, right? Is this idea that, these are majority popular things. People want the right to have an abortion. Maybe they do not. When you look at the polling, the numbers don't add up to where everyone's in agreement that abortion should go throughout the whole pregnancy. But certainly the idea that abortion should not be allowed after 6 weeks or not allowed at all is not a popular decision in any state in terms of majority, not majority. So I think we have to pull these people in and make them involved. We can't continue to let people be excluded, because the smaller the electorate, the greater chances that, groups that want to deny the rights to others are able to succeed,
Yeah, you mentioned how successful the Republican strategy was. Could the Green Party and other third parties use a similar strategy and contest the minor elections, which are mostly uncontested in America, for judges and governors and sheriffs and all these other different minor positions? It seems like there's an opportunity there for third parties to try and build a community to start to contest those and really to build a grass level movement.
Yes, absolutely. And the Green Party has been successful in that at the local level. The Green Party has had more than 1,000 victories. I think we have 135 sitting elected officials throughout the country. And the idea of running candidates at the state or federal level is to make sure these issues are being represented, certainly to try and win. Not saying we're not trying to win, but the idea that, look, if I'm not on the ballot, if the Green Party is not on the ballot in November, there is going to be no one here in North Carolina talking about single-payer health care. There's going to be no one talking about affordable housing. There's going to be no one talking about living wages. You might get something from the Democrat about a $15 minimum wage, which $15 in North Carolina was good 6 or 7 years ago. It's costing way too much here now, where rents are going up 20, 25%, to be making $15 an hour and have that considered a just or a fair, equitable wage. So all those things, getting rid of the war on drugs. We have 12 opioid overdose deaths a day in North Carolina. Let alone all the other implications of the war on drugs. The racist oppression of it, the way it's destroyed whole communities, purposefully, right? No one else is going to be talking about those issues. Those issues won't be present on the ballot unless, a third party candidacy, an independent candidacy, a grassroots candidacy, like the one that myself and North Carolina Green Party represent, are on the ballot. So the importance is there at state and federal levels. Even when there is so much money against it, you say, how are you going to compete against that? Well, you do, and you can continue to build, and you can continue to build. But no, absolutely right, Tom. At the local level, Green Party, other independents, small parties have had a good deal of success around the country, and I think that's where you continue to organize that and continue to build.
Absolutely. What do you think about essentially getting rid of campaigning or buying for money or vying for money altogether? Because as far as I know, the statistics show that most politicians spend up to like half of their time in office begging for money rather than actually doing their job. This seems like a
Yeah.
really big issue to me. Do you think we should make more of a standardized kind of election process where they have to do like a certain set of debates or get a certain amount of airtime that's split between the parties, and it's not just based off of how much money you raise, where you can just buy whatever you want?
Yeah, there's a great documentary on HBO. I think it's called Draining the Swamp, and it follows Tom Massey and Matt Gaetz, two Republicans, and not supporting them in any way, but they clearly show the burden that fundraising is put on them. One scene, Massey has to go across the Republican headquarters and get his list, the big stack of who he has to call. I worked enough in Congress, with this think tank I was at, to have gotten to know members of Congress personally, both Republicans and Democrats. And yeah, I mean, the things they tell you, all the stuff you hear is that your first day, you show up and your boss, either the speaker or the majority or the minority leader or whoever your boss is, gives you a card, and that tells you how much money you have to raise a day. And it's tens of thousands of dollars, may even be more than that, And of course, as we know, that if you want a committee seat, and more importantly, you want a chairman or a chairwoman seat, you have to raise more money. So the committees, this is what's really egregious about how Congress works with the money. The committees are divided out into 3 tiers. There's a tier, a B tier, and a C tier, or maybe it's 1, 2, 3. I can't remember off the top of my head. But those committees are basically most lucrative to least lucrative, right? Whoever has the biggest donors gets into the more lucrative. So you're talking about being on defense or agriculture, where these, and then on the bottom are, the committees that regulate post offices or whatever, even then, as we know with the post office issue, if you go and look at the people who over the last 20 years have been trying to destroy the post office through in our Congress, those people have been the biggest recipients of money from UPS and FedEx. So the entire thing is crooked, and the need to constantly fundraise is exactly right, Tom. And so I agree. The British have a system where you're only allowed to campaign over a 6-week window. I think we should move to something like that, where there is a limited campaign window. It's all publicly financed. I know people disagree with me on that, but that's the way I think is the best way to go. We have televised forums. Everything is structured in a way. Ballot access is much fairer than it is now, so people don't need to collect tens of thousands of signatures to get on the ballot. Look, in Britain, you want to run for parliament, you need 10 signatures to run for parliament. In Canada, you need 100. Throughout most of Europe and Japan, it's anywhere between 25 and 75 signatures, maybe a little more, to run for parliament. And the argument here that, you can't do that because too many people are going to run. The Canadian electoral system is not falling apart because they've got so many people on the ballot and they only need 100 signatures to run for parliament. So, I mean, a lot of the arguments against keeping people out are specious. And when you peel them back, you see that, there's a very real reason for it. And it's to protect the system that's in place. And the system in place is basically the money.
Yeah, that seems like a very clear conflict of interest, that if the committees are determined by how much money you raise, and I'm a company looking at, okay, so which committee is the one that determines my competitors or my policies? So I have to give this candidate this much money to put them into that committee where they can determine whatever I want. It seems like a clear conflict of interest there.
Right. And to get on the committee, so you get to Congress, Tom shows up his first day in the House, and he gets this is how many calls you have to make a day. This is how many people how much money you need to make a day. And by the way, if you want to be on, what committee is important to you? Agriculture? Well, that's a tier 1, Tom. That means you got to raise $50,000 more a day, or whatever the numbers are. I mean, it's obscene. And I think when you explain this to people not from the United States, they're oftentimes aghast. And worse, when you explain people to explain people in the United States they are not surprised. They take it as, oh yeah, I didn't know the details, but I assumed as much. I mean, that's how awful the system is.
Yeah, and it seems like in order to get on those committees, you're gonna have to be like, oh well, I don't know, Koch brothers, you want another sugar subsidy? Like, I need some money.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. And so the whole thing is crooked. And if you don't have any money, how are you represented then? I mean, that's what it all comes back to. And that comes back to the Green Party being a self-stylized pro-workers party. Like, as I said, we need to be much more than a party. We need to be the arm of a movement, to represent the people who've not been represented.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been going for about an hour. It's been great having you on. Great conversation. Really appreciate it. Do you want to give people links and information about where they can find more about the Green Party and your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom. Please go to MatthewHoforSenate.org. Last name spelled H-O-H. So Matthew Ho for Senate, for F-O-R. Please, you can go there, find out about our platform. If you like what I'm saying, if you believe in what we're trying to do, if you understand that we are up against right now, this legal fight with the Democratic Party. If we were libertarians, we'd be fighting the Republican Party. But if you agree with us, or you want to support us, we need your support. So if you can, please donate, because that's the only way we're actually going to beat these guys in court.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate you coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Hey, thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it, man.
See ya.